If you ask 10 Republicans, what does the Republican Party stand for? And they say, well, MAGA. Well, no, that's what Trump and the MAGA movement stand for. What does the Republican Party, absent Trump, stand for?
Yes.
What do you get? Fiscal responsibility? Give me one example.
So I want to shift to the national picture now and get your feedback and opinions about some hot takes that I had that were different than most. But I want to tell you about my trip first. I did a quick 2 minutes about going down there. And like I said, I'm an outsider, and I'm probably one of the first people that would call our Washington, D.C. occupied territory by a uniparty kleptocracy. So I do think there's a ton of corruption. But that's not really what I felt when I walked around the halls of Congress. It was a nice sunny day, and the whole building vacated at 4:30, and everybody was at Bellwether's getting on happy hour on a Wednesday, just patting themselves on the back for a hard day's work. I walk around Congress. I see a whole lot of people that are interns from Georgetown. A lot of people that look like they could be in a Democrat or a Republican office. It didn't really matter. And then I met some Republican representatives. Some of them were really great, but I felt like they were probably doing what you would expect out of a Federalist elected representative. They talked about their home district. They talked a lot about the things that were important to them. They have principles. They talk about national issues, but it's like you could tell that there was no form or intent behind it. They just do what they want. And at the end of the day, the only people I saw walking around Congress were mostly lobbyists. And so I've reformed my opinion in that, again, we know that the Democrats ubiquitously vote for what the Democrats need to. Yep. And you said maybe it's principles. I think there's also probably some support, some feedback loops that ensure that they vote the way they're required. My feeling was there was nothing like that on the Republican side, period. It was probably functioning as you would expect, but these people are put in a situation where they're ill-equipped to deal with the asymmetry. With a healthy smattering of narcissism, like I said, they construct a bubble that they live in that allows them to convince themselves they're doing the best possible. I think Speaker Johnson's in that bubble where he's like, I'm doing the best within this framework that I've been given.
Yes.
But the people want the framework shattered.
Right. Well, it goes back to this conversation about this first 100 days where they were only in session 44. They should have been in session 100 of 100 days. There aren't going to be another 100 days of the second Trump administration. So that was a rare opportunity. What they do? Well, they were over having the happy hour, telling themselves how smart they are and believing that the best and brightest in the country are in D.C. working in the federal government. I think they believe that. And what's missing from all that, I think you're right. On the Democrat side, there's the carrot and the stick. If you do what we ask you to do, you'll be taken care of. You're going to make a lot of money. You won't get in trouble. You could do some weird stuff. It's going to be okay. You can go hang out on an island. You could hang out at a ranch. No one's ever going to know. And on the other hand, on the Republican side, they don't have any platform. If you ask 10 Republicans, what does the Republican Party stand for? And they say, well, MAGA. Well, no, that's what Trump and the MAGA movement stand for. What does the Republican Party, absent Trump, stand for?
Yes.
What do you get? Fiscal responsibility? Give me one example. Small government?
Free markets, maybe, less regulation.
And I say all the time, Trump is the first free market president we've had in our lifetimes. And what I mean by that is, every other president, Republican and Democrat, allowed every other country to use trade, to use currency manipulation, to use export subsidies, export duties, this complex relationship of duties and subsidies and export credits that allowed them to manipulate trade so they could strategically capture market from the United States and Europe. And the Republicans, the Democrats, nobody responded. They said, well, free trade means any other government can do whatever it wants to the United States, but we can't do anything back. That'd be an attack on our allies. How is it an ally if their entire economic model is based on milking the United States? And what was this about building up China at this rate? with this massive GDP growth, shifting huge amounts of industry to China, entire industries that we used to have no longer have. And we
Oh,
think of ourselves as technologically advanced, not remembering that they build every single smartphone. I'm guessing that every piece of technology that's around me right now came from China, not one from the United States. And we think of ourselves as technologically advanced and better than them. No
yeah.
president
We're a
did.
service economy, Gary. We're a service economy. We can pat ourselves on the back for how high our productivity is. Like they
Like
come up
England.
with a metric.
Yeah. So the point is that by saying no, we're not going to accept your trade deficit generating, currency manipulations and export duties and credits, we are going to respond. We're going to create a truly free market where you're not manipulating and we're not manipulating. And if there are tariffs, they're going to be matched. You know, that's a free market move, not a market manipulation move. Just countering the manipulations they put in place is something that should have been done 40 years ago, but only one guy would do it, just one.
I
And
get a
the,
lot of crap because I say free markets aren't what we need. Because to me, free markets, I made a tweet about it today, is a clinic putting a sign hormone treatment therapy for minors across the street from a junior high school. That's what we saw a picture of. And that's free markets. You know what I mean? It's like,
right.
no, there needs to probably, yeah, they don't stand for anything. I think that's really right. And it's like there is corruption on the Republican side,
Of course.
but I think the corruption is that the special interests drown out the will of the voter through sometimes good intent. Still happens. And that there are probably some power brokers in the Republican Party that have outsized influences because of this complete disparate way that they manage themselves. So you get these Kevin McCarthy's that can pull a lot of strings. You get the Glitch McConnells that have too much power. And
Right.
those are the ones where the influence really, I feel like the financial leverage that you can apply to the Senate is probably maximized within the Republican Party, is my guess.
Well, yeah, and Kevin McCarthy is a perfect example of what's moderate, right? We were all told he's moderate, but if you look at his voting record from a standpoint of the Liberty score, it's an F. He was 54% voting in line with the Constitution and the conservative base that he was supposed to be representing. He was a radical. He was a radical aligned with the Democrats. So
And he's like a kingmaker in California who decides the marginal House seat, basically.
right. Well, once you get the job of being Speaker of the House, then all the donations come to you and you control this. And everybody says, well, yeah, but he can raise a lot of money. Well, so will the next guy, right? We can never change them out because he can raise a lot of money. The next guy gets in position, suddenly he can raise a lot of money. The money flows to the power. So when he walked away and took all that cash with him, now he's this king broker because he's got this PAC he controls. But over time that will dissipate, hopefully, and somebody more responsive to the American voter will take over. But when you think about that lackluster feeling that it sounds like you saw when you were walking the halls of Congress, why is it? Why is there no sense of urgency with this incredibly rare opportunity we have? It is because
no urgency at all. None at all.
They have no agenda. They have no passion for this MAGA agenda we want. So in the end, look, this doesn't mean I think it's hopeless. It isn't. I think it's just that the voters are going to have to they're going to have to stay engaged. They're going to have to stay engaged with their representatives and pressure them every single day to put this American agenda into place. They're going to have to withhold their donations, withhold their volunteer time, support candidates that are going to be maybe primarying some of these incumbents, these tired, corrupted incumbents. It's really up to the people. The job isn't finished because Trump got elected. And I think there's a lot of momentum out there. You look at the reaction to this Epstein debacle. People are upset. They're paying attention. They're not just saying, well, it's okay, let that one go by. They're angry that this is not going to be pursued.
Yeah. I've been 100%. Here are the numbers. 70% do not trust the federal government. 70% are following the Epstein story closely. 70% are angry at the waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. Like these people are not going to drop it. This is just part of, they know that there's two standards. Now, this is the part, this is the real part, like the question I'm most happy to ask you,
Mhm.
because your background kind of matches mine a little bit. I think you rose a little bit higher in the corporate ladder than I did before the vaccine mandate kicked me out of my corporate career. But I saw a lot of activity in the corporates that was, froth, churn, poor management, bespoke responses to problems that don't really get to the root cause and corrective action. And I feel like one of the reasons I was successful was because maybe I picked it up in my Navy days from Rickover, but this idea of systems thinking, which is that, well, no, let's look past the people and look at structures and alignment of incentives and feedback loops and stuff like that. And so here's the question I want to ask you. What work, in your opinion, has been done to reform the Republican Party recently?
None.
Okay. Twinsies, like that's my answer too, right? Like,
So, people said, well, but Laura Trump's involved. Listen, I'm sure she's a fine person. She was involved for a few months. She spent most of that time doing public relations work. She was out doing podcasts and on the Trump tour. I got to tell you, in Southeast Pennsylvania, Donald Trump's team were doing something in the neighborhood of 4 events a week in 24. We've never seen anything like it. They connected with everyone who was even thinking about voting. It was incredible. Well, she was doing some of that stuff, and she was doing podcasts and news hits and whatnot. Now, I don't think that she's a turnaround artist, right? I don't know her background, but I'm guessing she hasn't done a lot of cultural realignment within large organizations. So I don't think she had much of an impact. It's not that I don't like her or that, and her last name's Trump, but
yeah.
that's not as magic as you might think. It doesn't immediately bestow upon her the quality of an organizational turnaround leader. So I don't think she had any impact on this party. I think Whatley came in and he said, "Okay, I'm going to work with the Trump campaign. That's how we're going to get this done." And I think he tried to do that. Most of what happened, when you look at the local and the state and the national party, in my opinion, most of what happened in 24 to help Trump get elected came directly from Trump. This Trump Force 47 took over county offices. It absolutely engaged huge numbers of volunteers, of the numbers that hadn't been seen by the Republican Party in the past. It was incredibly effective, and it just captured the zeitgeist. People were excited. They were glad to be part of it. But that wasn't the Republican Party. In fact, if you look at the Pennsylvania Republican Party, and I've asked, I don't know, 1,000 people this question, no one thinks it did much to get Trump elected. They didn't stop him, but they certainly weren't pushing behind him. They would show up to events and they would, stammer around or whatever. But it was really Trump's campaign. It was Trump's surrogates who didn't spend their time on cable TV. They spent their time in the field talking to voters, right? That's what got Trump elected. And so I don't think there was a transformation of the party in 24. Nothing, I don't think, has happened since. In my part of the world here and in New Jersey, where I think you are, the biggest thing they've done is bring in this social media guy, Pressler, and they parade him around and say he's flipping counties. Well, if you look at the history and look at the actual data, the story that he got 180,000 Amish to vote, that's preposterous. There are 180,000 Amish in Pennsylvania. The total Amish population statewide is in the neighborhood of 90,000. In the county that this was supposed to have happened, let's call it 60,000. That's a big number. And so this was a ridiculous idea, first of all, that there are that many. Second of all, that after a couple of 100 years of being resistant voting, this character showed up who they had no knowledge of and isn't culturally aligned with them. And suddenly it was off to the buggies, let's go vote. Preposterous. And then you look at this idea of in counties. The statistics don't support that. Those counties flipped because people wanted to get into the party in the primary to vote for Trump. They flipped in April, long before this was announced. And then there's the claim of registering 50,000 voters. Guess what? There weren't 50,000 voters registered by that method in 2024 cycle. So it's just not possibly true. But this is now what the party's enamored with, and that's what they're doing. That's not restructuring your organization. That's
like taking your Fortune 50 company and bringing in Tony Robbins for
Yeah.
8 weeks in a row to give you motivational speech and then say, look, we just increased profits X% by some weird math that nobody knows about.
Right. And no one can follow, and it can't be replicated.
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
you know, as opposed to, say, restructuring an organization from the ground up around a purpose, a mission, a platform, and then aligning incentives so that everybody wants to see the wins that result in policy. I mean, I don't really care who gets elected to the state legislature. What I care about are the policies that get put in place by the state legislature. I care about the fights that they're having to get, not a fake voter ID bill, but a real voter ID bill put in front of the governor, and an option without him having the option of turning away. That's the kind of thing we need to see. There's none of that that's happened. I don't believe there has been a substantial reorganization or refurbishing of this party. I think it is as it was. And again, Trump is sort of like the pig through a snake, right? He comes through. There's a huge amount of activity, a lot of volunteers, a lot of donors, a lot of time. And then as he passes away, this thing will settle back down to what it was, unless the MAGA community, this grassroots patriot constitutionalist community, refuses to surrender, stays engaged, and keeps marching forward. That's
the problem. Just because I think they're committed, but there's only so long that you can engage and ask these people to give without recognition, without them making necessarily victories. And I think you're right about Trump too. I think that day is coming sooner than people think. It's not going to be 2028. It's going to be after 2026, where he starts to lose political capital because people are starting to look forward. Maybe the Democrats picked up stuff. Maybe the Republicans do a good job. But the reform has not happened. I just did this quick, and I showed this on the video. I think, it's a talking point. This stuff, but people watching us might not. I tried to have ChatGPT just give me a rundown of what are we dealing with? What do Republicans mean? And just having Whatley there for a year, again, just in the RNC, which has, it's a staff. I don't know how many of those people he fired or not, but it's like 100,000 volunteers who have probably not changed over. Then you have the NRCC. This is like Kevin McCarthy holdovers and other power brokers.
Right.
That's a huge staff. These guys probably allocate hundreds of millions of dollars a cycle. Then you have the NRSC doing the same thing on the Senate side. This is Mitch McConnell's buddies getting their palms greased. This is all like vendor, kickback schemes and maintaining the status quo and interfacing somehow with the state and local parties to keep everybody happy as Republicans, not as principled people. Then you have the RGA. And then you get to the state level, then there's 50 different state parties, and then there's county and local level parties, and you're dealing with tens of thousands of people. Michael Whatley can't show up at the RNC and make people be policy.
No.
It just can't do it.
No. I mean, a true organizational turnaround, I mean, it's a much more intense thing than what anyone thinks. And if they think Trump is somehow, this party is dedicated to him and not to their own interests, they're not paying attention.
What would you, if you had $1 billion to spend, how would you spend it? This is putting you on the spot because I don't think ChatGPT even had a very good answer for this. How does $1 billion get spent fixing the Republican Party?
Well, you go to the swing states first, and you would get organized around not the establishment Republicans who, like I said, in Southeast Pennsylvania have lost all influence. You would get organized around people who are passionate and care about the issues. And you would then create a machine akin to what I call the Hydra. The Democrats have a collection of hundreds of organizations that do things like data research. Those companies. They do things like messaging. They do volunteer engagement, voter engagement, volunteer management. They have this entire organization that starts the day after every election and re-engages the populace. I would build out a much simpler version of that. And one of the key parts of this would be getting real data that's accurate and properly analyzed so that people can see where they have to go. Part of this problem is that the party runs completely blind. I've sat
Yeah.
down with people who say they understand data, and I've listened to them talk about the numbers for a while. They have no idea what these numbers mean, and so I would start
Yeah.
outside the party, but parallel organization that would be there to message, there to do data analysis, there to support candidates, all of those things. But I wouldn't try to do it within the party structure necessarily because that's just too entrenched. And turning that over is going to take years. So I would go right for the immediate impact of getting an ideologically driven collection of organizations with very specific functions that then are either individually proactive on things like messaging, or again, working with candidates who really are going to be the MAGA, Freedom Caucus kind of candidate. That's the way to do it. And to if you want to move quickly, you can create that. People would line up to be part of it.
Oh, this could still happen by 26 for sure.
Oh, there's plenty of time right now.
We've talked about Republicans have a bad vetting problem.
Mhm.
They could do better. They often punt that to places like the Heritage Foundation that might have its own interests. And I hear that that organization is actually moving in the right direction, but we'll see. So this looks like this is good. This is the first good answer I've ever heard. And so to me, that's like, okay, we're talking about a national massive PAC.
Yep.
It probably has a think tank and it has a consulting organization that needs to be very, very brutally controlled, because I've heard the stuff about Republicans don't know data, but I've also heard about Republicans don't care about data because they're just going to direct mail everybody because it's more vendor money that changes hands.
That's right. No question.
So then,
money goes where the consultants make the most.
yep, that's a corollary. I'm going to tweet that as soon as we're done. And then, so then it's like, okay, well, between now and 26, you roll out 4 or 5 swing state chapters, sub-chapters of the PAC,
Mhm.
and you have some kind of central education and, interface with the national group.
Mhm.
And why is nobody doing this?
Well,
They were able to raise $250,000 to give to Ronna McDaniel, who lied about using it for election integrity.
right.
That all just lined people's pockets. And here's that money could have done this.
What we're talking about is not in the interests of the cabal that controls the party. It presents something that they wouldn't control. Something, I told you we do live events. We do these things, Keystone Town Halls, and we'll have candidates come in sometimes. Well, we'll have the unendorsed candidate come in. Party officials called their committee members and said they weren't allowed to come to one of our meetings because this is in 22, because we had an unendorsed candidate there, and they're not allowed to be in the room with an unendorsed candidate. That's insanity. Who does that? It just rips the party apart. So it's just not in their interest, and it threatens their control. They're not smart enough to say, wait a minute, we might not agree with this whole America First agenda, but this could be a way for us to have a sustained impact and maybe begin winning more races. They can't figure that out because they're just simply, ham-fisted, got to be in control. And another part of this would be to start getting people running for state party, because state committee members in Pennsylvania right now have very, very little influence. There's a process of whipping votes and intimidating people and trying to run them off committee that really keeps them from having a voice. So you'll see entire counties vote exactly the same way on every endorsement vote. I mean, the whole county will vote as a block. It's preposterous. But if you really got this state committee to function as an argumentative body where debate was happening and where policies were discussed and where candidates were vetted, not because of they're somebody's friend and connected to a specific consultant, but because they have an ideological bent, then you could start really having a significant impact on the party as a whole. These state committees are an unused resource, an untapped resource, because they're just controlled by pretty much the cabal.
So short term, money could very well, and this, I think that this is a conversation literally nobody's had publicly. And I'm excited about it. And I would make an appeal right now to Elon Musk to use his $1 billion not to create the America Party, but to fund that organization right now and find the right leaders to lead it, which shouldn't be as hard as everybody thinks. It could be done.
Mhm.
So then, like long term, it's like, okay, you have things like the precinct strategy that will bear fruit, but it's going to take another 20 years, and it should probably be accelerated somehow. And then from the top down, you have the issue of, okay, well, the people at the peak of these NRSCs, NRCCs, are they changing? How does that change? That's a whole nother question. And then finally, I guess the question too is, when it comes to Congress, when it comes to these votes,
Mhm.
obviously getting the right candidates at a MAGA level, primarying people, I, I hesitate to wonder how much return on investment an actual primary gets you. But what's the stick that the Republicans could build with money to be more effective at ensuring party line votes for
Well,
things that
mhm.
are principled for the right principles?
All of these people in Congress are working for someone. It's just not for the voters. It's just not for the Republican, conservative, grassroots. It's not for the people. But they're working for somebody. Who are they working for? Whoever's writing the checks. And to the more corrupt of them, I suppose they're working just for the bureaucracy that keeps feeding their, friends and family Mercedes and mansions fund. But but they're working for somebody. If you created an organization like this that could provide support in terms of policy work, not just these folks that are writing white papers and passing around to each other, but I mean really engaging the populace in getting behind pushing policy issues, that would be impactful. But then if you also had a pack where you were able to make meaningful donations to a select number of critical seats. This is where Elon Musk is getting it right in that he's not saying, I'm going to try to change Congress. I'm going to pick a handful of seats that I think I can have an impact in, and I'm going to use my money to get them elected. That would be a good strategy to take alongside this, because if you take the Freedom Caucus, Scott Perry in Pennsylvania and all these other guys, if you take that and you say, okay, well, we're just going to double that number. And not only going to double that number, but we're going to get a populace behind them. We're going to get a zeitgeist moving behind them that will support them and carry them forward. So they're not just out there as, considered the radicals on the fringe, but rather they're standing at the head of a column of agitated, engaged voters who are not going away. That's how you could more quickly begin to influence outcomes in Congress. But they'd have to hear you, and that takes two things: money and people. You've got to have the numbers on both.
Yeah, 100%. I've heard mixed reviews of the current state of the Freedom Caucus, but you're right. If they can throw around enough weight, that changes how all of these things are negotiated behind the scenes. I partly wonder if this big beautiful bill wasn't at least mostly written over the last couple of years of back scratching that just hadn't been paid in full yet. But I'm so cynical about these things. But I happened to talk to somebody in a relatively high position down there.
Mm-hmm.
And we had part of the same discussion in that Trump right now was smart in defining MAGA and gave a gift to the Republican Party that the Republican Party hasn't run with, and yet still seems to be benefiting politically from, because the Republicans actually outperformed Trump on a national popular vote perspective. But that's because Trump's on the ballot. And so that's not always going to be the case. And the second Trump's gone, MAGA is no longer a thing because Trump defines what MAGA is. So what does the Republican Party stand for? Unless there is intentful organizational work to be done, then the Republican Party is just going to go back to what it was doing.
Yes.
And they understand that message down there. And I think people are going to work on it. But I don't know what that looks like. And my advice was, well, there are a whole lot of new sugar daddies that aren't Ken Griffin or the Koch brothers that are new to this movement. And what's being done to engage them? If you look at, you got Elon Musk, but you have all these other tech bros. You got Peter Thiel. And again, some of these are pro H-1Bs, but again, let's agree that the problem is the Republican Party kind of sucks right now.
Yeah.
You add your Lonsdales and Andreessens and Bill Ackmans, and all of a sudden you have something that maybe can counter Ken Griffin. I don't know.
Maybe. But there has to be a cause. There has to be a purpose. There has to be a platform. And if post-Trump, the Republican Party goes back to the strategy that I described as polite surrender, they'll lose all of this momentum. No one's going to stick around except the people who think it's fun to go to cocktail parties with, county chairs. It's not going to be a meaningful organization. And, and of course, in some counties, they'll have absolute control as they have now. Nothing's going to change dramatically. It's simply going to settle back to the way it was. And then that organized, structured, disciplined, and funded Democrat machine I call the Hydra, it's going to resume consuming this country. So I said about 3 years ago to some really great people from York County, Pennsylvania. I mean, these are great patriots. They put their money in, they fight, and they've been turning school boards over. They've done great work. And we were talking at a meeting we had, and I said, listen, if you're not fighting in the counties that are further to the east, closer to Philadelphia, like this county called Chester and Delaware and Montgomery and Bucks, if the fight isn't there, then the Democrats are going to move into the next county, Lancaster, and then York, and they're going to start moving into that area that everyone has just considered to be deep red, impenetrable Republican territory. Well, we had a special election just a few months ago, a few months after Donald Trump won Lancaster County at plus 15, and a radical Democrat leftist beat an established candidate who'd won countywide office before. He beat him with mail-in ballots, where a minimum 17% of Republican mail-in ballots were cast for the radical Democrat. Could have been higher, depending on how you have to make some assumptions. Let's call it 17 to 24% of Republican mail-in ballots were cast for a radical Democrat leftist. And all of a sudden, a seat that hadn't been turned over in a long time, that no one thought could be turned over, is in the hands of a lunatic. That's just going to continue. That machine may have been dented by Donald Trump and this MAGA movement. It has not been killed, and it is going to start consuming again. And that means Wisconsin, and that means, Pennsylvania. That means Michigan will be back on. That's what's going to come if there isn't a radical transformation of this party. Yeah. And I think they are absolutely either they don't care, they're okay with that outcome, or they're just ignorant to that threat.
Or they're happy with the status quo and they aren't forward looking because short-term gains trump, long time. Let's say the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the Democrats are not gone. They're on the ropes right now. The national leadership picture is absolutely horrifying for them, and they're in a death spiral, but they will still get 46% of the electorate without even trying.
Yes.
And everybody's bragging about the Republican increases in registration. I wonder how many of those are just people that switched party registration to vote for Nikki Haley in the primary. I really wonder. It was a major thing. Hundreds of thousands of people did it. And so, again, 26 is going to be tough. It really is. And again, there's confounders that may change it. But the Republican Party is not earning the votes that they got right now, and Trump is, and it's going to be bleak when he's gone.
I agree. But again, the formula is so obvious. It's so simple. It's just really simple. It's okay. Let's take this MAGA agenda. Let's take all these executive orders and all the things were identified by DOJ. Let's turn that into legislation. And when they say, and this is maddening, when they say, well, but what if the Democrats hold a long speech in the Senate? What
make them crap their pants. Yeah. Make one of them die of a heart attack because they're 90 and they had to filibuster for 3 days. I'm sorry.
So you're telling me that we have to surrender the Republic because we're afraid that Democrats are going to pull off a long speech in the Senate? I don't think that's quite the threat that the Republicans in the Senate portray it to be.
Well, I can tell you that I told some people down there some of these very same ideas. And I asked somebody, what should the Republican Party stand for in a post-Trump world? And they thought about it and they said, well, definitely economic populism to rebuild the middle class and fix wealth inequality. And that inspired me. I'm like, okay, that's probably the right answer. It just has to get done. And right now, everybody's assuming Trump's going to do it. And he's done as much as one person can. But a lot of money has to go after this problem.